Don't forget to like and subscribe. The scariest stories of 2023. I once booked an Airbnb by myself in a rural part of Colorado, about 3 hours from home. The reason? A job interview in a nearby city. Since it was such a long drive, I figured I'd turn it into a short trip and explore the area a little. The Airbnb I found was far cheaper than any hotels, and though it was about 40 minutes from where I'd be interviewing, I didn't mind the drive. The listing described it as a secluded retreat with a scenic mountain view, and I thought that sounded perfect. A quiet, private place to prepare for my interview. The house was on a dead-end road, surrounded by dense woods, with a steep drop leading into a valley behind it. It was a small, rustic cabin, cozy but a little outdated. The owner, Greg, had left a welcome note on the kitchen table, along with some basic instructions and emergency contact numbers. It seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed for 3 nights. My interview was scheduled for Wednesday, meaning I had Monday and Tuesday to settle in, get some work done, and prepare. I brought my laptop and spent most of Monday catching up on work from my current job, sitting in the tiny living room on an old leather couch. Around 9:30 p.m., as I was reviewing some potential interview questions, I heard a noise. A single, deliberate tap on the front window. Not a knock. A tap. Light, almost hesitant. I looked up immediately, my heart rate spiking. The window was just a few feet away from where I was sitting, and beyond it, nothing but darkness. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from the dim glow of my laptop screen. I hesitated, then stood up and peered outside. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no movement beyond that. I told myself it was probably a bug hitting the glass. After all, I was in the woods. I shook off the feeling and went back to my laptop, though I couldn't shake the slight unease that settled in my chest. The next day, my interview went well. I felt confident about my answers and celebrated with dinner at a local steakhouse. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was just past 8 p.m. I changed into comfortable clothes, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat on the back porch, taking in the cool night air. It was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. Then I felt it, that eerie, crawling sensation of being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the treeline, but I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling was undeniable. I was being watched. I stood up, stretched to shake off the paranoia, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I shook my head, chuckling nervously at my own jumpiness. Maybe I was just spooked from the night before. Later that night, while watching an old movie on my laptop, the noise happened again. A single tap at the window. This time I jumped up immediately and rushed to the glass. Nothing. But I just knew someone was out there. I turned off the interior lights to try and see better outside. A mistake. The moment the lights went out, I saw it. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. They were perfectly still, just standing there as if they'd been waiting for me to notice them. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I hovered over the keypad. I wanted to call someone, anyone. But before I could, the figure moved. Not toward the house, but away, disappearing into the woods with an unsettlingly smooth gait, as though they had accomplished whatever they came for. I barely slept that night. I triple-checked the locks, kept a flashlight next to me, and left my phone on full charge. Nothing else happened, and by morning I began to convince myself that maybe it had just been a prank. Maybe some local kids messing with the tourist. Then Wednesday night came. I was in bed, watching another episode of my show, trying to wind down before sleeping. That's when I heard it again. Not a tap this time, but a click. A deliberate, slow clicking sound, like someone clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth. It was coming from the closet. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The closet door was cracked open just an inch, enough to see the absolute darkness inside. Another click. I felt my stomach twist. This time I didn't hesitate. I threw the blanket off and bolted out of bed, grabbing my car keys as I ran through the cabin and out the front door. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and called 911. As I sat in the driveway, my headlights illuminating the front of the cabin, I expected to see someone burst out of the house. But no one did. It remained eerily still. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers entered the cabin with their flashlights drawn. I waited outside, gripping my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When they finally came back out, they told me they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the house. But they did find something. Inside the closet, on the wooden floor, were small scratches, as if someone had been inside, pressed against the door, waiting. I left that night and checked into the first hotel I could find. Airbnb refunded me for my final night, but they refused to give a full refund since there was no concrete evidence of a break-in. The host, Greg, insisted that no one else had access to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, whether it was the owner, a previous guest, or a stranger, had been inside that house with me. To this day, I still wonder, if I hadn't left that night, what would have happened when I finally fell asleep? Story 2. James and Lisa had been together for a decade, and 2 years ago they had finally tied the knot. Life had been good to them, and they had recently achieved another major milestone, purchasing their first home together. Their new house was a charming colonial-style home nestled in the quiet outskirts of a small New England town called Fairhaven. The property was a dream come true, a spacious backyard, towering oak trees, and a dense woodland behind it that provided both beauty and seclusion. It was the perfect place to start the next chapter of their lives. James worked as a systems analyst while Lisa was a nurse, and their schedules lined up in a way that allowed them to spend their evenings together. The first 2 nights in their new home had gone by smoothly, filled with the exhausting yet rewarding process of unpacking and settling in. However, on the 3rd night, something bizarre happened, something that would cast a shadow over their fresh start. It was Monday night, and they had just gone to bed, their bodies still sore from moving furniture and arranging decor. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as it adjusted to the night's chill. Then suddenly the sound of music filled the air. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, an eerie, staticky melody drifting in through the closed windows. Lisa sat up, startled, looking at James with wide eyes. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. James nodded, quickly getting out of bed. He moved to the window and cracked it open. The moment he did, the music became unmistakable, an old song, something from another era. The scratchy recording carried a voice that sounded almost hauntingly cheerful. A quick search on his phone later identified the song as "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" by Henry Hall. It was meant to be a light-hearted tune, but under these circumstances, it was nothing short of chilling. James's stomach turned. The music wasn't coming from a neighbor's house. It was coming from their backyard. Grabbing a flashlight, he made his way downstairs, Lisa following close behind. By the back door, he found the light switch and flicked it on. The floodlights illuminated their yard, revealing nothing unusual, just their neatly trimmed grass, the wooden fence, and beyond that, the dark silhouette of the woods. The music played on. James took a deep breath and stepped outside. The cold air nipped at his skin as he scanned the area. Then he realized the music wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from the trees. The song ended just as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind an unsettling silence. James stood there for a moment, waiting for something, anything, but there was nothing. He eventually returned inside, locking the door behind him. "Maybe it's just some kids messing with us," he said, though even he didn't fully believe it. Lisa nodded, but the uneasy look on her face lingered. The next night, they tried to convince themselves it had been a one-time occurrence. But when they turned off the lights, it happened again. This time the song was different. "Tiptoe Through the Tulips," a song notorious for its unsettling presence in horror films, blared through the night air. It was unmistakable now. This was deliberate. James stormed to the window, and that's when he saw it. Something small was sitting in the middle of the yard. He didn't hesitate. "I'm checking it out," he said. Lisa grabbed his arm. No. Let's call the cops. We will. Just let me see what it is first. He stepped outside, his heart pounding in his ears. As he approached the object, he realized it was an old-fashioned radio, its dials cracked, its casing rusted. And yet, it had been playing music as if brand new. James reached out and switched it off. The silence was immediate, yet something about it felt wrong. He picked up the radio and turned back toward the house, lifting it slightly as if to say, "Look at this." Lisa's reaction wasn't what he expected. Her face twisted in sheer terror and she screamed, "James, run." His blood ran cold. Why? There's someone behind you. He didn't turn to look. Instead, he sprinted toward the house, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lisa was already dialing 911, her voice frantic as she explained what had happened. James peeked through the blinds and saw them, 3 figures standing in the tree line. They weren't moving, weren't coming closer. Just standing there watching. The police arrived surprisingly fast. Officers searched the yard and the immediate tree line, but the figures were gone. They took the radio as evidence, though they seemed skeptical of the whole situation. Might be some locals playing a prank on the new folks, one officer said. A prank? James scoffed. That's what you think this is? The officer just shrugged. We'll keep an eye out. If it happens again, call us right away. After the cops left, James and Lisa sat in the living room, both too shaken to return to bed. What if they come back? Lisa whispered. James swallowed hard. If they do, we're getting it on video. That was 3 weeks ago. Since that night, the music hasn't returned. No figures have been spotted. But neither James nor Lisa can shake the feeling that someone, or something, is still watching. And every night before turning out the lights, they listen. Story 3. Before my last job, I had worked in multiple hospitals and care facilities, moving between different cities. Eventually, I ended up at Pinewood Rest Home, a quiet, tucked-away elder care facility in Vermont. It seemed like a peaceful place, a change from the fast-paced hospitals I was used to. But I quickly learned that peace was just an illusion. During my 3rd week, I was assigned to the night shift, midnight to 8 in the morning. I was exhausted from consecutive shifts and barely had any energy left. That night, I was put in charge of the memory care unit. Most of the residents had dementia or Alzheimer's, and though they were generally calm, they often struggled with restlessness or confusion. I had learned to be patient, but one woman, Eleanor, unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Eleanor had been more agitated than usual, whispering about strange figures in her room. She kept glancing toward the corner, muttering about the silent visitor who would watch her as she slept. Her roommate, Ruth, had asked for her bed to be moved closer to the window, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. Most of the residents had fallen asleep by 11:30 p.m., but Eleanor stayed awake, sitting upright in bed. When I checked on her, she gripped my wrist and whispered, "He's standing right there." I followed her gaze to the empty corner of the room, my stomach twisting. I reassured her as best I could, urging her to rest, but unease had begun to settle over me. Around 2 a.m., I was in the supply closet, refilling my cart. It was a narrow, dimly lit room with shelves stacked to the ceiling. I had just closed the door when I heard something behind me, a soft shuffle. I turned sharply. Nothing. Swallowing down my nerves, I continued, trying to shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Then I felt it. A hand. Cold, firm, gripping my shoulder. I whirled around so fast that my back hit the metal shelves, sending supplies crashing to the floor. My breath caught in my throat. But there was no one there. Just silence. Heart pounding, I grabbed my things and hurried to the door. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. Through the small window in the door, I saw him. A figure in a long black coat, his face obscured by the dim light. He was watching me. My scream echoed down the hallway as I stumbled back. The door flew open and another nurse, Kelly, ran in. What happened? Are you okay? I gasped for air, pointing at the window. Did you see him? The man in black? He was just there. Kelly's face twisted in confusion. There's no one out here. We searched the hallway, checked the security cameras. Nothing. No one had passed through. My hands trembled as I tried to process it. Then we heard Eleanor. She was crying out, thrashing under her blankets. When I entered her room, she looked straight at me, her eyes wide. You saw him, didn't you? She whispered. A cold chill ran through me. I hesitated before nodding. What does he want? She clutched the blanket tighter. He watches. He waits. That was the last shift I ever worked at Pinewood. I turned in my resignation the next morning. The head nurse was understanding, but I never told them the real reason I left. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe paranoia. But when I think of that cold hand on my shoulder and Eleanor's knowing expression, I wonder if something darker lingers within those walls. And I hope I never find out. Story 4. It was a Friday night around 1 a.m. and I was driving home from work, taking my usual route. I had left the office around midnight, so by the time I was getting close to town, it was about 1:15 a.m. The town where I live is pretty isolated, not many houses, just miles of woods surrounding it. I was cruising down a quiet road just a few minutes away from home, with a cornfield on one side and a thick forest on the other. It was midsummer and the temperature was mild, about 23 degrees Celsius, so I had the top of my convertible down. The sound of the wind and the empty road was almost hypnotic. I was going around 50 miles per hour when suddenly I heard it, a woman's scream. It wasn't just any scream, it was a desperate, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere in the woods. My heart immediately started racing, and without thinking, I slammed on the brakes, bringing my car to a screeching halt. The scream was unmistakable, coming from the left, deep in the woods. I didn't know what to do, but something told me I had to help. I quickly got out of the car and grabbed the baseball bat from the backseat. Taking a deep breath, I shouted into the forest, "Is anyone out there?" The response came almost instantly, another blood-chilling cry, "Help! Please help me!" Fear and curiosity were battling inside me as I ran toward the sound. Each step took me deeper into the woods, pushing branches and bushes out of the way. The woman's cries never stopped, but they seemed to stay the same distance, always in front of me, never getting any closer. I shouted for her to keep screaming so I could follow, but the deeper I went, the more unsettling the situation became. I began to feel something wasn't right. No matter how fast I ran, the screams stayed the same, like they were coming from a place far beyond where I could reach. My heart started pounding as I yelled out, "Where are you?" Again the scream came, "Help!" I froze. This wasn't right. It felt like I was walking into a trap. I quickly turned around and started running back toward the car, panic beginning to set in. The further I ran, the more I heard the scream. No matter how much closer I got to my car, it remained at the same distance, as if something was following me, leading me back. I could barely catch my breath as I sprinted through the forest, my eyes fixed on the flashing headlights of my car through the trees. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and sped off without a second thought. My hands were shaking as I called 911, reporting what had happened. I wasn't sticking around, not after that. When I got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. A few days later, I saw a news report that made my blood run cold. The body of a woman, probably in her 30s, had been found in the forest by a hiker and his dog. The report said there were no signs of foul play, but the location of the body was eerily close to where I had heard the screams. The forest is large, and I knew it wasn't an exact match, but the coincidence felt too strange. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was as if I had been somehow connected to her death, hearing her cries from beyond the grave. Story 5. Before my girlfriend Emily and I officially started dating, we used to hang out all the time. We both loved snowboarding, and her family had this little cabin in the mountains of New Hampshire, not far from White Mountain Resort. This was around our 10th time hanging out, and she invited me to spend the weekend with her, snowboarding for the first time together. The drive was about 5 hours long, and as we neared the cabin, we took this incredibly winding, secluded road. The kind where you barely see other cars. Most of the driveways we passed were blocked off by thick walls of trees, and we were way up in the mountains, so it felt like we were alone. Emily explained that many of the houses were owned by people who lived out of state, just like her family's. As we drove, I slowed down when Emily suddenly shouted at me, "It's coming up." I almost missed it, but there was a small opening in the trees that led to a narrow trail. We followed it in four-wheel drive until we reached the little cabin, which was blanketed in snow and looked incredibly cozy. We parked, turned the heat on immediately, and unloaded our things. Since it was already getting dark, we just cooked some of the food we brought along and watched the pursuit of happiness to wind down. The cabin had everything we needed: heat, electricity, but no running water. Her family used large jugs of water for things like washing dishes and hands. The catch was there was no indoor bathroom, so Emily told me we had to use the outhouse. That night, I only had to pee, so I braved the cold and stepped outside to relieve myself in the snow. It was snowing heavily and the cold air bit at my face, but the night was peaceful. After a while, we fell asleep during the second movie we watched. We woke up early the next day to get the freshest runs on the mountain. After breakfast, I had to go to the outhouse again, but when I stepped outside in my shoes, I noticed footprints in the snow. They were large, and I couldn't tell if they were from boots or something else. I followed them, and they wound around the cabin and into the woods. I called Emily over, and she thought they might be from a black bear since they're common up here. We went snowboarding for the day, had an amazing 8-hour run, and stopped at a diner for dinner before heading back to the cabin. By the time we got there, it was pitch black and it was snowing again. We started a fire, cranked up the heat, and played some music while we drank. Eventually, I had to go again, so I threw on my boots and went to the outhouse. As I approached, I slammed the door shut to keep the cold air out. I could still hear the music blasting inside, but over that, I noticed footsteps crunching in the snow outside. I called out to Emily, but she didn't answer. I quickly texted her, asking if she was outside, but my message didn't deliver immediately due to bad reception. A few minutes passed, and I was almost done when the music inside the cabin stopped. I froze. The silence was deafening, with nothing but the sound of snowflakes hitting the ground. I stepped out of the outhouse and realized the lights in the cabin were off. I figured the power might have gone out, but when I used my phone's flashlight, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the cabin. I followed them around to the front door and knocked loudly, yelling Emily's name. Suddenly, the door swung open and an arm grabbed me, pulling me inside. It was Emily. She slammed the door shut and locked it. She whispered frantically that someone had tried to open the door while I was outside. Apparently, when she saw it wasn't me at the door, she locked it, turned off the power, and hid in a corner. She watched in horror as a stranger slowly passed by the living room window, peering inside. She didn't know what to do, so she told me about the hidden cellar under the floor where her dad kept a couple of rifles and shotguns. We made our way to the cellar in the dark, and I grabbed one of the guns. We sat quietly on the couch, too scared to turn on the lights, worried it would expose us. Outside, all was silent again, except for the soft hiss of snowflakes hitting the ground. Then I heard footsteps again, this time right outside the door. My heart raced as I grabbed the gun, marched to the front door, and fired a few rounds into the air, shouting. The footsteps stopped. I hoped the shots scared whoever was out there, and the echo of the gunfire masked the sound of someone running away. The next morning, Emily's dad recommended we leave, saying it wasn't safe to stay there. They weren't worried about anything being stolen, but we weren't about to take any chances. At least we got our full day of snowboarding in. That night was one I'll never forget. Story 6. My name's Jason, I'm 25, and I live on a small family farm in northern Tennessee. It's not a huge operation, just a simple family farm. I help out when my parents are away, as I'm the oldest of 3 and the only son. They want me to take over when they're older, but honestly, I don't see myself staying here for the rest of my life. This place is remote, and after a strange event last summer, I really don't feel comfortable here anymore. My parents had taken a week-long trip to the coast, leaving me and my two sisters, Sarah and Emily, to take care of things. Sarah is in college online, so she spent most of the time in her room working, and Emily and I just hung out watching TV. We've all talked about leaving the farm life behind, but as the oldest, I feel like I'm stuck with the responsibility. One of the hardest parts about farm life is dealing with predators, both the animals and the people who come to steal from us. It's happened a couple of times, and we've got some firearms just for situations like this. It was late in the evening when things took a strange turn. The dogs outside suddenly started barking wildly. Something spooked them. I went outside to check, and they were both staring toward the field. I yelled at them to calm down, and they fell silent. I stood there for a second, trying to figure out what was going on, when I heard whistling coming from deep in the cornfield. It was definitely human. This was my first time dealing with a potential trespasser on my own, and with my parents not around, I knew I had to handle it. I rushed inside to grab one of the guns, and as I stepped back outside, the dogs were barking again, even more frantic this time. I told my sisters someone was in the field and I needed to scare them off. They both thought it was a bad idea, and I realized how dangerous running into the field in the dark would be. So I went back to the dogs, fired a shot into the air to scare whatever was away, and shouted for whoever was out there to get off our land. The dogs quieted down, and my sisters started laughing at how ridiculous the situation was. We all joked around for a minute, but that moment didn't last long. Suddenly, the dogs went crazy again. I went outside ready to shoot again, but froze when I saw a figure standing just 20 feet away, right in front of the cornfield. He stared at me for a second, then bolted into the field. I ran toward the spot and fired another warning shot into the air. I wasn't about to venture into that dark field, so I grabbed the dogs and brought them inside. We called our dad, and he told me to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He suggested I fire another warning shot if the person came back. So we all went to our rooms, bringing the dogs with us. I kept the gun close by. Later, while I was watching a movie on my laptop, I heard whistling again. I rushed to the window and saw the guy walking through the grass, still whistling like he was trying to mess with us. I quickly grabbed the gun, aimed out the window, and fired a shot in the grass near him. It was just enough to break his little game. He ran off, disappearing from view, and didn't return. We never found out who it was or why they were messing with us. Maybe it was just some teenagers trying to scare a couple of farm kids, or maybe it was someone with more dangerous intentions. Either way, I was relieved that they never came back.